Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about creating an MLA Works Cited page in 9th edition MLA, which is the current version of MLA at time of filming. The cover for the 9th edition MLA looks like this. Basically, 9th edition MLA is a slight set of modifications to 8th edition MLA. Every few years, the MLA comes out with new guidelines, and typically the reason for those changes has to do with shifts in media types, has to do with the emergence of new digital media forms that need to be cited, or is a response to changing ways of thinking about how we cite, document, access information, etc., etc. So the current edition is the 9th edition, which came out, I think, in 2021. And in this video, I'm going to take you through a works cited page. The other major side of citations is in-text citations, and I'm going to do another video about those, so you'll get that information. I want to start by saying that the less crucial thing, it's not that important necessarily to sort of memorize the structures of citations, right? The thing that's really useful, actually, particularly if you are watching this for like a first-year writing course or something like that, the way that my students are, is that you learn to find correct citation information. So a lot of rhetoric textbooks have this information. The MLA handbook has this information. The other sort of big source is Purdue OWL, the Purdue Online Writing Laboratory. But I'm teaching out of the structure of argument. And so this is the one that I'm gonna talk you through. So in this textbook, the beginning portion of chapter 15 is about MLA. So the first bit is MLA in-text citations. That's really important, but we're not talking about that in this video. So we want MLA Works Cited entries. Now in this textbook, that starts on page 427. For other textbooks, obviously, it will be different. But what we have in structure of argument is a pretty common approach that many textbooks use, many rhetoric textbooks use. So it is worth being familiar with this, and structure of argument is a pretty good example. So one of the things that you will generally have is something called a directory. It may not be called a directory in all textbooks, but that's a pretty common term for it. Basically, this is a list of the type of citations, or of what different types of citations would look like. Now, this is actually a somewhat interesting thing, because 9th edition MLA initially kind of tried to do away with this structure of here's what X type of citation looked like, and they tried to create a more fluid guide, a sort of core elements structure. And I will show you what that looks like in just a second. But that was very hard for people to use, particularly, again, people in first-year writing courses and things like this. So most textbooks retain this structure, and actually the MLA went back to doing this as well. So what the directory will show is basically a set of different entries, and each entry is numbered, and then typically it has the page number. So there's a few that are more common than others, things that you would definitely want to be familiar with. So a book with a single author, that's often going to be the first entry. But things like a work in an anthology, an edition other than the first, these may be quite important as well, depending on what type of research you're doing. So in order to use this directory, you want to go to the page number. So let's say you have, let's say you're looking at a work in an anthology. Let's say you wanted to cite one of the articles, one of the sample essays out of structure of argument, for instance. So for a work in an anthology, that's on page 430, entry number 6. So what we want to do is go to page 430 and then find entry number 6, which happens to be right here. Different textbooks will then take slightly different approaches. What this textbook does is basically just give you a sample. So entry number 6, a work in an anthology, they've got a sample entry here. So that is what it would look like. What I don't love about this structure is that it depends on you as a reader to know what each of these parts are. So Sarafizad Said, I'm sure I said that wrong, I apologize. It depends on you to know that that is the author's last name, comma, first name. And then in quotation marks, paranoia with a period. It depends on you to know that that is the title of the individual work. New American Stories in italics depends on you to know that that is the title of the anthology, etc., etc. I'm not a huge fan of this approach where they just give you citation samples. I think it's much stronger when a textbook or an MLA guidebook or whatever it is will give you a sort of formula, right? So it would say last name, comma, first name, period, in quotation marks, title of article, period, close quotation marks, all that stuff. So it tells you what these things actually mean. That being said, this is a really, really useful resource. And then one other thing that textbooks will often do is give you these sort of full-page breakdowns of important types of sources. So this is an article from a database, and it gives you a screenshot of an article from a database. It tells you where to find the key information and what that key information is. So that's actually really, really useful. There's one more thing I do want to tell you about these kinds of directories. They often have quite a lot of entries. So in this case, this one only has 36, which actually isn't that many for an MLA citation. But part of the problem is that it's sometimes difficult to distinguish between... It's sometimes difficult to distinguish what exactly type of source you're dealing with, and those may not look quite the same. So for instance, we have an article from an online journal versus an article from a database. Those are two different types of citations, even though they might be hard to distinguish. And if you see, article from an online journal, but what you've actually found is an article from a database, you're not citing that correctly. So it's very important to know exactly what type of citation you're dealing with, what type of source you're dealing with. And sometimes that's not easy because there are so many different types of sources, and not all of the distinctions are going to be intuitive. So that is the sort of benefit of going through a citation guide a little bit and starting to get sort of familiar with the different types of citations. So now I want to take you to some actual MLA stuff. Okay, so I want you on half of the page and you on half the page. Perfect. Okay, so what I've got on the left-hand side of my screen here, this is what I was telling you about before, right? With the sort of flexible guide that MLA has created, these core elements. So basically in this system, there are 9 elements. Start with the author, and realistically, it's generally going to be last name, comma, first name for the primary author, but then first name, last name for subsequent authors. We'll talk more about that in just a second. Title of source, title of container, other contributors, version, number, publisher, publication date, and location. you can probably tell why this guide in itself was not all that useful for most people. But I'm going to show you how it works by taking a look at a sample Works Cited page. And that's what we've got over here on the right-hand side of this page. So the first thing I want to do, I'm going to move that over here. So the first thing I want to do is actually take you through the formatting of the page itself, and then go through the individual entries and discuss the pieces of them and how they align with this core elements chart. So we've got several problems here with this. I'm actually going to go ahead and just make this full size for just a second here. So we got several different issues with this. This is not a properly formatted MLA Works Cited page. So I want to take you through some of the things we need to do to make sure that this is set up correctly. The first is with the phrase Works Cited here. That's correct. It should be there, but it should be centered. The second thing is actually with the overall spacing of this. This is single spaced, and what we really want for pretty much everything in MLA is that it should be double spaced. This goes for the body of the essay, and it also goes for the Works Cited. We also, and this is probably a less important thing, but it does actually matter, you want to make sure that in this paragraph menu up here, that don't add space between paragraphs of the same style is chosen. Now, we have one more major issue with this formatting, which is that all of this needs to be set up with a hanging indent. So the easiest way to do that probably is to go to paragraph settings, that same menu, and under indentation, special, just select hanging. It should automatically default to 1/2 inch. So that will set it up like this. So every entry starts at the edge of the page, and every subsequent line is indented 1/2 inch. Now, you don't want to try and do this by hand. Don't. I've seen people do this where they will, I'm going to try and do this just to sort of demonstrate why this is a bad idea. So if I do this, let's say I press tab here. Okay, so that hasn't worked out right. I want that back. I'm going to try and get it. Okay, yeah, so this is part of the problem, is that MLA doesn't really want to do this. What you can do is something like that, where you press enter and then tab the thing in. Now that's automatically sort of set that spacing there, which is okay. But the problem is if I then realize, oh, I've forgotten info in here, or I'm worrying about proofreading that, then what ends up happening is that kicks it down onto the next page. So I don't want to do that. I'm going to take this out. Reformat this properly, and I'm going to actually do the hanging indent by hand, which you can do with the sliders up here on the ruler tool if you want to. Anyway, so hanging indent is an important part of MLA citations. The other thing that you need to do for a correct Works Cited page is to alphabetize by the first piece of information that we get in the citation. Generally, that will be the author's last name, or in the case of someone like Aristophanes or Cher, I guess, one name, whatever it is. When you don't have an author listed the way we have for these last two entries, you're going to use the first word in the title to alphabetize. So this is what we're looking at here. Now, we want to, there we go. Okay. So now I want to go through this Works Cited page because we've got a lot of different types of sources here, and I just want to go through and follow along with this core elements chart. So What we got first here is a book, which is a second edition. So the first thing we have, Taiki Alfred, the author, last name, comma, first name. Because this is a book, the title of the source is going to get italicized. Peace, Power, Righteousness, and Indigenous Manifesto in italics. Now, both of those get followed with a period, and you can actually see this here, right, in this core elements chart. They end up with periods. Pretty much everything else uses a comma. So in this case, version, second edition, publisher, Oxford University Press. In MLA format, we often just do UP or U Oxford P if it was University of Oxford Press. And then the publication date, 2009. Now, location on here does sometimes throw people off because some citation sources, I think APA still requires this and Chicago style still requires this, ask for a place of publication. So if this is Oxford University Press, it would be Oxford, UK, I think. MLA doesn't really require that anymore. I think it was the 7th edition was the last edition that regularly required the place of publication. It just isn't that crucial anymore. So, yeah, location tends to be more in terms of like digital location these days. And we'll talk about that with some subsequent sources. So that's the structure, right? So book with a single author, second edition. Book citations tend to be pretty simple and straightforward. That being said, this one is a little bit more complicated because, there's one other thing that location tends to be, and I'll tell you that in just a second. So this one is a little more complicated because this is basically a full-length work in an anthology with a translator and an editor. So you've still got Aristophanes, the author of the text, with a period. Title of the source, The Birds, with a period. This is the play. Again, it's a full-length play, so it gets italicized. Then we have other contributors. So translated by H.R. Webb. And then for this, there's a few different approaches that people sometimes take because this guide offers flexibility in MLA citations. That is one of the big strengths of the Core Elements Guide, is as long as the information is there and is roughly in an order that aligns with the guide, it should be considered correct. So in this case, we've strangely enough kind of got, so I can take you through the logic of this in a little more detail than is probably crucial. So we start with the translator, who's actually an other contributor. We start with the translator because he's the translator of this play, not the translator of the whole thing. So then we've actually got the title of the container in the complete plays of Aristophanes, other contributors to that, edited by Moses Hadass. So that's the editor of the complete plays of Aristophanes. Then we've got the publisher, Bantam. We've got the publication date, 1988. And then location, in this case, because this is a smaller work within a larger work, the page range. Yeah, that might have been more detail about this specific citation that was actually useful or whatever it is. But moving on, I want to point you out another thing here. So the next two entries, we actually have two works by the same author, two things from Paul Cartledge being cited here. So the first time, Paul Cartledge is listed. The second time, rather than relisting it, in MLA we do a dash, space, dash, space, dash, period. And that means the same author as the previous entry. Now, this citation is a book citation, simple and straightforward, title in italics, publisher, publication date. This one, this is an entry in an anthology. So, but this is also the first time we have a shorter work being cited. So, whereas previously our titles have always been italicized, here our title is in quotation marks. That indicates that it's a shorter work. So in this case, it's a chapter, but it could be an article, it could be a poem, it could be a short story, something like that. But it's a relatively smaller, self-contained work within the larger work. Other than that, the basic logic remains the same here. Now, the next one, Rick Knowles, this is an article from a library database or an online database. So the same general opening stuff begins, last name, comma, first name, author, title in quotation marks because it's a shorter work. Now, within this, we do actually have an italicized bit, and that's because Knowles starts his article with the title of the work he's writing about. So The Death of a Chief is a larger work, but then everything else is in plain text within the quotation marks. So that's the title of the source here, again with a period at the end. And then we have the title of the container, Shakespeare Bulletin. So that's the journal that this was originally published in, not the database. That's a really important distinction here. When it says title of container, and this is an article that you found through a database or something like this, you're going to give us the title of the journal itself. Then version number, that's pretty straightforward. Volume 25, number 3, and this is how these would be formatted typically in 9th edition MLA. Vol period 25, comma, no period 3, comma. Publication date, fall 2007. Older versions of MLA, you just gave the year. Now you want to give more specific information, as specific a date as you can. So for journal articles, that will often be either a season, so winter 2022, fall 2019, or it will be a month, March 1995, December 2023, whatever it is. You want to give the most detailed date that you can. Then we've got a page range. Again, that's the location of this within this edition of Shakespeare Bulletin. That's actually missing a period. But then after that initial location, we actually have more location information. We've got this stuff here. So Project Muse in italics, this is the title of the database. Basically, this is, again, additional location information. So this is the title of the database, the actual technology that helped us find this. And then you want, preferably, a DOI. Now, a DOI is a digital object identifier. Basically, this is a sort of permanent digital location for this source. Theoretically, as long as the internet exists, this DOI, this link here, will take you to this article. If you can't find a DOI, then the next best thing is what's called a stable URL. And some databases will give you a stable URL. JSTOR, for instance, gives you a stable URL, whereas something like Project Muse will give you a DOI. Something like Academic Search Complete may give you a stable URL, it may give you a DOI, or it may or may not give you either. If you can't find either of those things, a standard URL is the next best thing, but that's a lot less stable and trustworthy. So this is the digital location information. Now, if we take a look at this next one, this is actually a YouTube video. This is an increasingly important type of source in the world, in research that we do, in drawing on especially visual information. So the way that you would cite this, we don't have an author for this. And so we're going to leave that out. And that's standard. Anytime you have a source that doesn't have an author, and we'll see this with the next one as well, you're going to start with the title of the source. And we've kind of seen this principle at work earlier, right? Like if we go back to Paul Cartledge's book, we don't have a title of container, other contributors, version, number, or location. So anything that we don't have, we just leave out. It's not a proper part of the citation. So in this case, we've got the title of the video in quotation marks because it's a short video. Then we've got the title of the container, which is YouTube, uploaded by, this would be sort of publisher, sort of, other contributors, maybe. It doesn't really matter how we think about this, but the channel that published this, the channel that uploaded this, then the publication date, again, because this is a YouTube video, we can have quite a specific date, and then the location, the URL for the video. Same basic thing applies for this. This is an article on a website, not a scholarly article, not a scholarly journal, not found through a database. We have just the title of the article. We have the title of the container or the publisher, Indians.com. That's the website. We have the date of publication, and we have the URL, right? So that's standard stuff. One other thing I want to mention to you, and I don't have any examples of this on here, but if you had more than one author, there's a couple of ways you might approach this. So if you have two authors, this is basically what it would look like. The first author is listed last name, comma, first name, and then the second author would be listed first name, last name, with and between them. Now, the reason the first author is listed last name, comma, first name is because the last name would be the main thing that we would be looking for when scanning down this list of works cited. So this is what we alphabetize by, and so it's important that this be the first piece of information in the citation. Now, under 9th edition MLA, if you have 3 or more authors, rather than listing them all out, and I actually don't think this is a great change that MLA has made, I think it's better to list them all out because that gives everybody citation credit, but MLA has done away with that. You can still do it if you want to. It's not wrong, but they no longer recommend it. So if you have 3 or more authors, you would list the primary author, last name, comma, first name, and then follow that with the term et al., et space al period. And this comes from the Latin that basically means and everybody else. So it's a way of saying this person and all of the other people. And that actually does show up in the in-text citation for 2 authors, you would list both of their last names. In the in-text citation for 3 or more, you'd list the primary author and then et al. So that does actually show up again. But that is your basic set of guidelines for 2009 MLA Works Cited pages.